If you've got your Bibles with you, if you turn to Job. On Wednesday nights I've been going through Job, and I thought I'd keep going. We'll eventually get through there. So Job chapter 15. Nothing to play with on this book. Not like little furry bits or anything. I'll do my hands now. We'll quickly just read through chapter 15 of Job. So it says, Then answered Eliphaz the Temanite, and said, Should a wise man utter vain knowledge, and fill his belly with the east wind? Should he reason with the unprofitable talk, or with speeches wherewith he can do no good? Yea, thou castest off fear, and restraineth prayer before God. For thy mouth uttereth thine iniquity, and thou choosest the tongue of the crafty. Thine own mouth condemneth thee, and not I. Yea, thine own lips testify against thee. Art thou the first man that was born? Or wast thou made before the hills? Hast thou heard the secret of God, and dost thou restrain wisdom to thyself? What knowest thou that we know not? What understandest thou which is not in us? With us are both the grey-headed and the very aged men, much elder than thy father. Are the consolations of God small with thee? Is there any secret thing with thee? Why doth thine heart carry thee away, and what do thine eyes wink at? That thou turnest thy spirit against God, and lettest such words go out of thy mouth. What is man that he should be clean, and he which is born of a woman, that he should be righteous? Behold, he putteth no trust in his saints, yea, the heavens are not clean in his sight. How much more abominable and filthy is man, which drinketh iniquity like water? I will show thee, hear me, and that which I have seen I will declare. Wise men have told from their fathers, and have not hid it, unto whom alone the earth was given, and no stranger passed among them. The wicked man travaileth with pain all his days, and the number of years is hidden to the oppressor. A dreadful sound is in his ears. In prosperity the destroyer shall come unto him. He believeth not that he shall return out of the darkness, and he waited of the sword. He wandereth abroad for bread, saying, Where is he? Where is it? He knoweth that the day of darkness is ready at his hand. Trouble and anguish shall make him afraid. They shall prevail against him as a king ready to the battle. For he stretcheth out his hand against God, and strengthens himself against the Almighty. He runneth upon him, even on his neck, upon the thick bosses of his bucklers, because he covereth his face with his fatness, and maketh collops of fat on his flanks. And he dwelleth in desolate cities, and in houses which no man inhabiteth, which are ready to become heaps. He shall not be rich, neither shall his substance continue, neither shall he prolong the perfection thereof upon the earth. He shall not depart out of the darkness. The flame shall dry up his branches, and by the breath of his mouth shall he go away. Let not him that is deceived trust in vanity, for vanity shall be his recompense. It shall be accomplished before his time, and his branch shall not be green. He shall shake off his unripe grape as the vine, and shall cast off his flower as the olive. For the congregation of the hypocrites shall be desolate, and fire shall consume the tabernacles of bribery. They conceive mischief, and bring forth vanity, and their belly prepareth deceit. Pray. Dear Lord, Heavenly Father, we just thank you for the day, Lord, and we just thank you for the rain and just the opportunity we have just to gather in your house today. And I ask you just have your hand upon me, Lord, and just give me wisdom as I speak, Lord, and just calm my nerves now. And, Lord, I ask you just to help me to speak things that I've studied, Lord, and that you would have me say. In Jesus' name, amen. So I thought I'd just give a quick overview of what's happened so far. Obviously, Job starts off in In sort of the first 2 chapters of Job, there's a controversy that takes place between Job and So the controversy that's taken place between his friends, Job and his friends now, has been preceded by a controversy that's taken place between God and Satan. So when we're first introduced to Job in the start of the book, we're told of his remarkable character, that he was blessed with a large family and many possessions. So in the first chapters, we learn of this controversy between God and Satan concerning Job, where Satan comes before God and asks whether he's considered, God asks whether he's considered his faithful servant Job. And Satan responds to this by attacking Job's character, and that his fear of God was only because God had blessed him. Satan had said that Job would curse God if everything was taken from him. In response to this, God puts everything that Job has in Satan's power, with the exception of Job himself. In one day, Job loses pretty much all his material possessions through various calamities. His sons and his daughters are all killed. And this deeply grieved him. He was deeply grieved, but through all this, he still continued to worship God and does not charge him with wrong. And again, Satan appears before God, and the Lord asks him whether he's considered how Job has remained faithful despite his losses. And Satan then makes another challenge, saying that Job would curse God if he himself were harmed. So God allows Satan the power over Job to the point of actually taking his life. And with such power, Satan strikes Job with boils, covering his entire body. And his wife seems to lose faith, lose what faith she has, and basically tells him to curse God and die. Now, Job, however, refuses to sin. And it's at this point his 3 friends have showed up, and his 3 friends are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And they have come to mourn and comfort him. Now, however, they're shocked to see the condition that he's in. In fact, they don't even recognise him to begin with. And they sit with him for 7 days, just in quietness. Now, having sat in the silence for the 7 days, Job finally speaks. He begins by cursing the day he was born and the night he was conceived. And he laments why he did not die at his birth. He also wonders why the suffering. He also wonders why the suffering who long for death are allowed to linger. And he concludes by stating that what he most greatly feared has now come upon him. From what he sees here, there is no rest for him. And through all this, he still doesn't curse God. He still doesn't blame God for his trouble. And so between chapters 4 and 31, Job and his friends will go back and forth in a series of debates. The first set going from 4 to 14, which we've been looking at on Wednesday nights. So this is chapter 15 is really the start of the second round of debates that are sort of going between his friends who are trying to comfort him and Job. Now, I'm not sure how they used to comfort people back then, but this is probably not the way to go about it. So, we know the condition of Job. We're told that. So Job chapter 2, verse 3 tells us, the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and sheweth evil. Still he holdeth fast his integrity, although thou madest me against him to destroy him without cause. So the main theory of Job's 3 friends is false. Their position was that God never affects a righteous man. So since Job is afflicted, he must be a sinner. Now we must keep in mind that God has not caused the affliction of Job, but he has allowed it. And God allows the suffering of people. He also sends blessings on all people as well. So at this point in chapter 15, all three of Job's friends have had their first go at him, comforting, I guess. And Job's responded to them and defended himself. And so the discussion is now going to go on again. So they're going to have another go at comforting him in his time of need. So this time they get a little bit harsher with their comforting. They don't hold back as much. They held back in the last few chapters either. But so we're just going to go through chapter 15, just pick a few things out of it. So firstly, Eliphaz decides that he's going to rebuke Job for speaking unwisely. So Job's just, chapter 14, Job's just sort of finished off a speech to all three of them and spoken in his defence. And so this second round of speeches begins with Eliphaz basically taking up response to Job's statement. And in this round, the friends and Job each defend their same views as before, but each sort of states it a bit more strongly. They become more determined to stand their ground. So he begins by criticising Job's statements as vain or empty knowledge. And we've seen just verses 1 to 3. So then answered Eliphaz the Temite and said, should a wise man utter vain knowledge and fill his belly with the east wind? Should he reason with unprofitable talk or with speeches wherewith he can do no good? So he begins by criticising Job's statement as vain or empty knowledge, like the wind blowing, effectively calling Job a windbag. Now he asks if this kind of speech, if this is the type of speech one would expect from a wise man, and accuses Job of using unprofitable talk, which could do no good to prove his case. Now, these statements are pretty typical of someone who disagrees with another person's view. These statements are typical one person who disagrees with another person's view, but the other person refuses to accept the argument that they have made. So in short, this is basically a debate going on. Now they can't agree, and so they naturally view that the other is making useless speech that proves nothing. So in verses 4 to 6, he says, yea, thou castest off fear and restraineth prayer before God. For thy mouth uttereth thine iniquity, and thou choosest the tongue of the crafty. Thine own mouth condemneth thee, and not I, yea, thine own lips testify against thee. So now Eliphaz begins to claim that Job's speech were based on sin and condemns him. So he claims to have an explanation for why Job argues as he does. He claims that Job was guilty of sin, and this would be based on the assumption that all suffering is the result of sin, and his speech resulted from his sin. In other words, his sin taught his mouth to speak evil and his tongue to be crafty. The implication of this is that Job spoke to defend himself because he refused to admit his error, not because he was really innocent. And so Eliphaz claimed that Job cast off fear, that he was not afraid to defend himself because he was determined to deny his guilt. He claimed this hindered or restrained prayer before God. This seems to mean that Job's failure to admit his error prevented him from truly repenting and being forgiven. So Eliphaz argued that Job's own words testified against Job and condemned him. Now, he thought he did not have to condemn Job because Job stood condemned by his own speech. Now, of course, Eliphaz did not demonstrate or prove in what way Job's speech had condemned him. As usual, he just makes a statement and claims it and expects it to stick without any proof. And it's sadly the truth that people often do speak to justify themselves even when they are guilty. Now, they don't want to admit error, and so their speech is the result of their sin. We encounter this often in our daily lives. So the problem is that Eliphaz's statement overlooks the fact that a truly innocent man will also claim that he's innocent. So it's not just a guilty man that will claim he's innocent, but an innocent man will claim he's innocent as well. The fact a man claims to be innocent does not automatically prove him to be guilty. There are two types of people. those who are guilty but refuse to admit their guilt, and those who are really innocent. The only way to distinguish which is true in any particular case is to actually present a convincing argument of someone's guilt. So Eliphaz's statement simply repeated the fundamental error of all his friends, and that is that they were convinced that Job was guilty simply because he was suffering so terribly. You know, this thought was fundamental to their entire argument. It was fundamental to everything they had said. So if Job then claimed to be innocent, he must be speaking deceitfully because, of course, he was guilty in their eyes. Now, they did not know this. They couldn't prove it. They had not produced any evidence or testimony of sin that he committed. Just the fact that he was suffering was proof enough for them. You know, this can be a warning to us, to bringing our own wisdom and our own preconceived ideas. Can have an extremely negative effect on those we're talking to. Now, had these men really sought God's wisdom in the area, then this book probably would have been a lot different, probably a lot shorter too. Now, these men could have been a true comfort team instead of the hindrance that they seem to be. So we see in verses 7 to 10, it says, "Art thou the first man that was born, or wast thou made before the hills? Hast thou heard the secret of God, and dost thou restrain wisdom to thyself? What knowest thou that we know not? What understandest thou which is not in us? With us are both the grey-headed and the very aged men, much elder than thy father." So thirdly, Eliphaz then attacks Job's wisdom and the source of his knowledge. You can really hear these sort of the mocking that comes off his words, can't you? You know, art thou the first man that was born, or wast thou made before the hills? You know, he asked Job if he was the firstborn, made before the hills. This point is sort of preparing the way for his next argument, which is going to happen in verse 10. That happens in verse 10, that the aged men agree with his friends. So how could Job disagree with them? You know, was he older than the old men who supposedly agreed with his friends? If not, then by implication, he could not disagree with their conclusion. He did not have enough seniority. We find out later in the book as well that the three men, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, are older men as well. So we're not sure if they're older than Job or not, but they're basically using this seniority there and asking Job, is he older than the people that agree with them, to prove their point. And he asked Job, had Job somehow received some special revelation from God that gave him wisdom to know things that he taught, the wisdom that he alone possessed but had hidden from all others. Of course, Job had already stated that he wished to discuss the matter with God in previous chapters. But Eliphaz asks how Job knew he was right and the friends were wrong. You know, what source of information did Job have that his friends did not have? And he makes this bold claim that he and the other friends had to be right because the view they defended was held by the wise, the aged men among them. Why, men even older than Job's father agreed with them. This is the same argument that Bildad had used in previous as well. You know, because they were old, they were right. Sometimes it works, not here. Now, once again, these friends appealing to human authority and human wisdom, which they've done throughout the entire thing. They had no evidence from God. And like all human authority, they cited could be wrong. You know, no man is infallible, no matter how old they are. You know, so as often the case, those who were wrong. So it's often the case, those who were wrong, which in this case were the friends, accused the others of being wrong. They said Job refused to admit his error when they were the ones refusing to admit theirs. So next, fourthly, Eliphaz claims that Job did not appreciate God's word, else he would not turn against him. He said in verses 11 to 13. It says, are the consolations of God small with thee? Is there any secret thing with thee? Why doth thine heart carry thee away? And what do thy eyes wink at? That thou turnest thy spirit against God, and lettest such words go out of thy mouth. So Eliphaz asked a question that implied Job did not appreciate the blessings God had given him. God had consoled or comforted Job and had spoken gently to him. Perhaps he was referring especially to the things the friends were trying to teach him. They thought they were giving him gentle consolation from God, but he was rejecting it. He claimed that Job's heart moved him away from God, moved him away from God's revelation, and caused him to wink or to overlook what God had done. This is not a good wink, this is a bad one. Shutting the eyes against his sin. Eliphaz claimed that Job spoke as he did because his spirit had turned away from God. Now, how far could they be from the truth? So he then continues on and claims that no one is pure in God's eyes. In 14 to 16, it says, what is man that he should be clean, and he which is born of woman that he should be righteous? Behold, he putteth no trust in his saints. Yea, the heavens are not clean in his sight. How much more abominable, I can't get that word today. Abominable. That one, everyone else can read it. And filthy is man, which drinketh iniquity like waters. So, he appears to be attempting to disprove Job's claim that he was upright by arguing that no one is upright before God. Now, he says that no man born of woman could be upright or righteous before God. He claims that God does not trust anyone, not even his saints, and the heavens themselves are not pure before him. So how could man be pure before God? Since man is abominable and filthy, drinking iniquity like water. This last verse seems to be a direct accusation of Job. This argument is obviously foolish. In the first place, what proof did Eliphaz have that even the heavens are not pure before God? And if his statements were true, then they would condemn Eliphaz and his friends as well as Job. So why aren't they suffering like him? The biggest problem is that it's simply not true. The biggest problem is that it's simply not true that everyone is as wicked as Eliphaz makes out. We know from the first few chapters of Job that Job was an upright man, even as he claimed to be. This is the result of his right living, his relationship with the Lord. Some people were upright and worthy of God's favour. For Job was one of them. It is interesting to observe how some people still today, in an attempt to prove unscriptural doctrines, make men out even worse than they are. It is true that all men have sinned, but some do repent and have right relationships with God. Wouldn't it be a bad thing if only... wouldn't it be great if bad things only happen to bad people, though? But what if we stepped out of line with God? It would make everyone a little bit more cautious about what they did and said, though. There are some terrible men and women out there today who it seems that are being blessed, and this just doesn't... it rejects the argument that Eliphaz had to. So he continues on in verses 17 to 19, and he declares the condition of evil men. So he says, I will show thee, hear me, and I will declare, which wise men have told from their fathers and have not hid it, unto whom alone the earth was given, and no stranger passed among them. So these verses are sort of introductory, leading up to the description of Eliphaz gives of the wicked in verse 20. And there seems to be a bit of pride in these verses. And he says that he's about to declare things that he has seen and has been told by wise men, men whom the whole earth was given. You know, these are men, it must be men who are entrusted. The reference to a stranger, sorry, not verse 19, and no stranger passed among them. This reference to the stranger here passing between them possibly refers to a stranger to God, a man of wickedness. Someone that might contaminate the truth that they had discovered. Now, again, the friends appeal to the wisdom of men, especially to those who are older, those who are wiser. And so he continues on claiming that a wicked man suffers pain all his life. In verses 20 to 22, he says, the wicked man travaileth with pain all his days. The number of years is hidden to the oppressor. A dreadful sound in his ears is in prosperity the destroyer shall come upon him. He believeth not that he shall return out of darkness, and he is waited for of the sword. Now here is what he wants Job to hear. The wicked travaileth or thrashes in pain every day, but no one knows how long his suffering will continue. His ears hear dreadful sounds, and even when he prospers, suffering is about to come. For the destroyer comes upon him despite the prosperity. Nothing he can do will prevent the consequences. He has no confidence that his suffering will end and he will return from darkness, because the sword awaits him as a result of his suffering. I'm not sure if this is meant to be sort of like an exaggerated, like a bit of an exaggeration on Eliphaz's part, or if this is what he thought happened to every wicked person. You know, Job was surely suffering in some of these ways, but he seems to be an extreme case. You know, not all sinners suffered. Yet Eliphaz seems to take for granted that every evil person will suffer like this. Now he continues to view the wicked as facing trouble and hunger in the next few verses, 23 and 24. Continues on, he said, he wandereth abroad for bread, saying, where is it? He knoweth that the day of darkness is ready at his hand. Trouble and anguish shall make him afraid. They shall prevail against him as a king ready to the battle. You know, the wicked man cannot find food, can't eat. He wanders around seeking it, but can't find it. He knows a day of darkness or of suffering, possibly even his death awaits him. He fears that trouble and anguish will come upon him, and sure enough, they do. You know, they attack and overpower him like being attacked by a powerful king. You know, this in many ways does describe Job's case. But remember, Eliphaz is describing the suffering that comes to wicked men, not just Job. You know, he went to great extremes to argue that suffering comes from being evil. Now, he was so convinced that Job was a sinner. And so he continues to state that man suffers because he was rebelled against God. In 25 and 26, he says, for he stretcheth out his hand against God and strengtheneth himself against the Almighty. He runneth upon him, even on his neck, upon the thick bosses of his buckles. Now he continues to argue that the suffering he has described comes upon men as a consequence of sin. The man that has stretched his hand out is an act of defiance against God. You know, we might express it that he's sort of shaking his fist in God's face. He is stubbornly pursuing a course to antagonize God, as though he's an enemy armed for battle against him. You know, again, this is how Eliphaz viewed men who were suffering as Job was. It was a consequence of their blatant rebellion and stubbornness against God. And while many people act this way, and they sometimes suffer for it, you know, not all people that rebel against God suffer in this way. And not all who suffer are guilty of such rebellion. You know, this is simply not Job's case, and the whole description is an incredible slander against his name. To speak so to the righteous man who is suffering as Job has suffered, it's just not right. He even continues on. Verses 27 to 30, in the same type of thing, so same type of thought. Because he covereth his face with his fatness, and maketh callops of fat on his flanks. And he dwelleth in desolate cities, and his house, which no man inhabiteth, which are ready to become heaps. He shall not be rich, neither shall his substance continue, neither shall he prolong the perfection thereof upon the earth. He shall not depart out of the darkness, and the flame shall dry up his branches, and by the breath of his mouth shall he go away. Just as the wicked man may seem to prosper temporarily, Eliphaz says he may increase in his fatness of his face and his waist, but he will dwell in desolate cities that no one else wants to inhabit, destined to become ruins. He will not be rich or continue in wealth. His possessions will not spread over the earth. Able to escape from the darkness of this suffering. Sorry, he said that back in 22 and 23. He says they're not going to be able to escape from the darkness of their suffering and agony. He'll branches dry out due to flames. As the fire consumes the branches of a tree, so shall punishment come to him. This sort of So the idea sort of is that the man who has been prospered as a tree shall be consumed as the fire consumes it. It also has the idea of taking away offspring as well. So those branches. So it sort of has that reference to that offspring being destroyed as well. He will ultimately be destroyed by the breath of God's mouth, it says. This does not sound pleasant at all, especially if you're a wicked person. You don't want this. But why does Job deserve it? He continues on in 31 and 33 by saying the wicked should not think of him escape. The him that is deceived, vanity shall be his recompense. It shall be accomplished before his time, and he will not be green. His unripe grape as the vine, and shall cast off his flower as the olive. Is to enlarge his description, saying the wicked man should not trust in anything that might deliver him from suffering. Anything that he would trust it to do so would be futile, or he would be deceiving himself. His reward would be futility or emptiness, and it will come before his time. His branch will not be green, and he will drop unripe fruit like the grapevine and blossoms like the olive tree. And so these may refer to offspring, and not only will he suffer, but his children will suffer. Not prosper either. And of course, this has happened to Job. He's lost his children. And once again, Eliphaz sort of assumes this is because of sin. So he concludes his argument in 34 to 35 by summarizing sort of the trouble of hypocrites. It says, "For the congregation of hypocrites shall be desolate, and fire shall consume the tabernacles of bribery. They conceive mischief and bring forth vanity, and their belly prepareth deceit." So he concludes his description saying, hypocrites will be barren of company, and the fire consumes the tents of those who commit bribery. The barren company could refer to family or friends, but the point appears to be that the hypocrite will lose everything. And those who obtain possessions or through bribery will lose them to tragedy. Such men by their wickedness are like a woman who conceives and gives birth, but what they conceive is trouble, and what they bear is futility. From their womb is born deceit. Now, what a tragic description of evil. Some people do suffer such consequences in this life for their sins, and those who do not repent will receive even worse after this life. But the sad part was that none of this fits Job's case. Everyone who suffers is guilty of sin, which constituted an unbelievable accusation against an upright man. You have to feel gutted for Job right now. And how much more? There's not much more than a week has gone by. He was this happy man living a life with his family, upright man. He didn't want for anything, and he had a great relationship with God. And now he's lost his wealth, possessions, his health, and his family. His wife seems to have lost her faith, and his friends, the ones who are here to help him, well, you get the impression that they have been sent by the devil himself, the way they treat him. He's a man undone, and his friends have found it necessary to drive him into the ground for an imagined sin based on their worldly knowledge. And the worst thing is that they think they are helping. They think this will bring Job to a place of repentance to get his life right with God. Now, don't be like these guys. And we don't have the power or the knowledge to judge a man's situation or spirituality. All we can do is love and comfort people when they are suffering, show them the love of God. In doing so, they will know God's comfort and, if needed, his conviction.
Thanks, Nathan. Let's turn to number 1 as we close this morning.